Good afternoon, everyone, Bioneers community. Welcome to today's conversation on the power of community, aligning governments and grassroots for urgent climate action by finding effective pathways forward for integrated climate action using whole systems approaches, leveraging collaboration across multiple sectors, and centering equity throughout. My name is Carrie Fugit. I go by she, her. I work at Daily Acts organization as our Leadership Institute program manager. I am calling in from Petaluma, California, Coast Miwok land, and I am honored to be facilitating and moderating today's conversation. I am incredibly excited to introduce our inspiring panelists, Lil Milagro Henriquez, an executive director and founder of Mycelium Youth Network, Brett Kincairn, Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and Resilience in Boulder, Colorado, and Trayton Heckman, Executive Director and founder of Daily Acts organization. I'd love to get our speakers and let you introduce yourselves as well, where you are, and a quick check-in. How are you guys doing today? Lil, would you like to start us off?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Lil Milagro Enriquez. I'm the executive director of and founder of Mycelium Youth Network. We prepare young people for climate change, and we are based here in occupied Ohlone land, which is also known as Oakland. And I'm doing really well. Excited for the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Lil. We're so excited to have you. Brett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in this world today. Brett Kincairn with the City of Boulder and also the director of the Urban Drawdown Initiative. I'm typically in the occupied lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho. I'm up actually in the mountains today because 8 years ago today, my wife went into labor with my son, and we're up here to celebrate his birthday. So we're having a lot of fun up here.
That sounds fantastic. Thanks so much for calling in today. We're excited to have you. And Trayton, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good to be with you all today. My name is Trayton, and I'm in Petaluma, California, in the Petaluma River watershed, the land of the Coast Miwok.
Awesome. And would love to get a sense of who all is in the room with us here. Where are you zooming in from? How are you doing today? Do you guys work in grassroots, coalitions, nonprofits? Do you work as part of government in an agency? Are you part of a business or something else? Would love to hear from you and what brings you to today's conversation. So before we get started, would love to hand this over to Lil to invite a land acknowledgement and holding space for gratitude for the Indigenous peoples upon whose land we're on.
So Klasoka Matli, Carrie, and hi. I would like to first just invite us to be able to take a deep breath. If you are sitting, if you are standing, please make sure your feet are firmly on the ground. And just breathe in the space and the land that you are on. Feel that beautiful sacred energy that is coming up from Earth. And acknowledge, for many of us, we are not on the lands of our ancestors. And so how do we thoughtfully and with great compassion and humility acknowledge the land that we are on and whose land this previously was? And for us here in Oakland, Colorado, we are on Ohlone land. And one of the best ways that I found, and this is something that I've learned through all my experience in organizing and being in different spaces, is that the best way to honor that land acknowledgement is both to recognize that we are on Native land, as well as to figure out what are the issues that are affecting Native communities today. And so in whatever way that you can, you don't have to do this right now, obviously, but in whatever ways that you can, find out the issues and the struggles of the people whose lands we are on and how we can have a meaningful relationship with the people whose lands we're on. And as we think about what that means and how that leads into equity, it's also very important to recognize that equity isn't just the recognition of racial or cultural divides, but also thinking about it in terms of how we can develop sustainable long-term relationships across a plethora of different issues, whether that's ableism, heterosexism, heteropatriarchy, whether that's against homophobia, whether that is pro working class communities, but find out the issues that are affecting both the indigenous people whose land you are on, as well as the people who are surrounding us, who might not necessarily have the same level of privilege, or who might be dealing with other issues. And so the best way that we can do that is to start having those meaningful dialogues and conversations from a place of humility and from a place of not knowing. And one of the ways that we do that, that Mycelium Youth Network, my organization, is by thinking, how can we grow that from the grassroots, from the roots? And so for us, that really means not just how do we make sure that we are having and engaging a thoughtful relationship, although that is an amazing first step to be able to take, but also looking about how do we freedom dream together? How do we enter into a conversation where we're imagining and building the world that we want to see every single day? So not just acknowledging the ways in which oppression happens or functions across a plethora of isms, but that we're also thoughtfully and creatively looking at how we can dream together of a better world. So I just wanted to leave us with both that deep breath, that like rounding into the earth, and then the acknowledgement that we are always in larger conversation and communication and relationship with so many beings around us. So thank you.
Thank you, Lil. That breath is so calming. And your call for sustainable long-term relationships and really growing this from the root really, really resonates. And is why we want to have the first question for you is looking at root causes. If we're going to take a whole systems approach to the work we do, what's at the root of what we're really trying to shift? And this is going to be hard in just a few minutes each, but we'd love to go around and hear your thoughts as in terms of a deep analysis of root causes that you're trying to address in the work you do. So we'll go back to you, Lil.
Yeah, and so for us, when I think about root causes, I think about the ways in which so often the structures that we enter into are already set up in ways that are inequitable. And so our solution, and one of the ways that, I really acknowledge people to think about it is like, how do we start thinking institutionally, and how do we start bringing in different ways of thinking at the very, very, very beginning? Because oftentimes the issues that we're dealing with are that we're calling people in to the table after all the work and the thinking has been done. And we just want people to sign off on a platform. And for us, it's like, how do we actually have people there from the beginning? How do we create ownership and buy-in from the beginning, again, across a plethora of issues? And so I think that for us, like one of the things that I would like to really have us think about as root causes is how do we start thinking creatively at the very beginning and inviting in that ownership, inviting in that responsibility, inviting in also that accountability to so many other communities.
Thank you very much. And Brett, would love to hear from you on this.
Well, first, I really appreciate that we're starting with this question, because I think too often we don't interrogate our underlying logic or our theory of change around these sorts of things. For me, a big factor, as far as I'm concerned, in what's driving almost all of the major system failures that we're experiencing today, climate change, biodiversity loss, equity issues, and racial justice, toxics in the environment, has to do with how our economy functions and what it values, and how we've set up the rules of the game to essentially require that companies maximize profits for short-term gains, irrespective of the impacts and losses that has, especially on the things that are the commons of life: air, water, soil, human relationships. So I think we have to be thinking about a fundamental restructuring of the economy if we're going to be successful in achieving the types of changes that we're looking for.
Thank you, Brett. That definitely resonates. And Trayton, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, just building on that lens of the commons, there's a book called Leading from the Emerging Future, which does a great job of framing up some of our problems and the needed approach, very equity at Bioneers. And at a simple level, they frame it as moving from ecosystem awareness and function to ecosystem And the ecosystem only cares about self or a group's interest. It could be a person, a political party, a country closing its borders. Ecosystem cares about the well-being of all, the commons and all the people. In this age of disruption, our siloed top-down structures no longer work to solve one issue at a time. A reactive business as usual approach no longer works. These create organizations and systems that are designed not to learn. And so we need a coordinated vision and strategy for a new green economy, like what the Green New Deal's laid out at all levels of government and community. And this needs a new mindset and approach that's more adaptive, open, collaborative, that fosters innovation and engages all the stakeholders in a community, and then to rapidly share and spread and build more that works. And this new type of thinking requires a new type of organizing and a new type of social infrastructure. And most of the examples I touched on this morning, for those who may have been there, required addressing these issues to come up with solutions.
Fantastic. Well, you covered a lot of root causes very quickly. I wanted to add too, from some of the conversations we had leading up to this, that one of the themes we really resonated with amongst this panel was the realization that our economy is really fueled by a divide and conquer approach based on racism, and that we need to address racism fundamentally as part of this economic overhaul and come together and not be divided along lines of race or other isms. And that is really a core fundamental root cause we need to be addressing in all the work we do. So now we'd love to dive a little bit more into how each of your organizations approach change. What are your theories of change? What are the levers you see in addressing these problems? These are huge problems. They're very deeply rooted. How do you approach change, and how does that approach look like on the ground? What does it look like in theory, but also more importantly in practice and application? How are you collaborating with across sectors, across grassroots and government? And how are you approaching the work you do? So we're going to start with you, Lil, and would love to hear about how you approach deep systems change out of Oakland.
Yes, thank you. And I do have some slides that I will be sharing as I talk about what it looks like at Mycelium Youth Network. And I'll go ahead and share that now. So Mycelium Youth Network is a fairly new organization. We started in 2017, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we do with young people, how we do it, why we chose this particular avenue, and then what that has meant for us to be able to build bridges. I also really want to acknowledge the understanding of when we think about even starting an organization, or when we were looking at what did we want to do in the world, we thought about how do we make this conversation as equitable as possible from the ground up. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that, but as the presentation goes along. So anytime I begin any presentation, I always want to acknowledge a few different places that actually grew me as a person, because I think that as we look at what organizing and what change can look like and the types of larger transformational structures we want to be able to see in the world, that we need to acknowledge how we as individuals walk into that space so that we are creating something that does not feel siloed, but something that feels like it is comprehensive and all-encompassing of who we are, because this is, I really believe, the moment that we need to start bringing our full selves forward to be able to make that change. And for me, that goes into three different places. One is El Salvador, which is also known as Cutzatlan, the family where my mother's family is from. And this picture on the left that you can see is actually of a mountain in El Salvador when I was doing my organizing in my master's degree program. And it looks like it's a fairly green space. But if you look a little bit closer, you can see that a majority of that green is actually not old growth trees. It is new trees. And you'll also see a lot of corn that is planted. And so El Salvador recently received attention for the 2 hurricanes that came through. And what had happened during the process of colonization is that they stripped a lot of the old growth forest that was really rich in natural resources with animal and wildlife. And they put this up so that every time we have heavy rains in El Salvador, we'll see massive mudslides. And it forced then populations, native populations like Nahuatl Pipil, which is where my family is from, identify as a detribalized Nahuatl, descendant of Nahuatl Pipil people, to move from their ancestral lands where they were able to have sustainable relationships to the cities, which then put additional strain on those same cities. And then the next space is where I grew up, New Orleans, Louisiana. This picture is actually from a block away from my dad's home. My dad still lives in New Orleans East. And outside of the different wards in New Orleans proper, it was one of the hardest hit areas in climate change. And if you look closely, you can actually see that it says help now on there. And then there's a circle, and you can't really see it very well in this picture because it's so small, but it has a number and the date of when help came through. And then it also has right next to that if they found anybody that died in those houses. The last picture is from this past summer in the Bay Area where I live now. And it's when the sky turned orange. And so because of the massive amount of forest fires that were happening. And we are in theory in fire season here in California. And we've received, I think, like less than 2 inches of rain this year, which tells me already that fire season is going to be heavy. And I bring all of these places up to think about, yes, climate change is real and it is urgent and it is having a direct impact right now. And the systems and the processes that allowed for climate change to even come to this place have been in place for generations and generations and generations. And they have already had a direct impact on me, on my family, on my ancestors. And so I want to really bring all of that into this conversation as we even think about being able to look forward. So the work that we do is we prepare young people for climate change. And the girl on the right is named Lila, and she's 10 years old. And I asked her to share just a little bit about what she has learned in Mycelium Youth Network. And so I'll just read it really quickly. But she says, Mycelium has helped me learn how to be a scientist, herbalist, and activist. It has taught me how to find information and use the information to learn about the world and the people around me. In a world where adults never seem to listen to kids, Mycelium has helped me stand up for myself and use my voice to help my community, my family, the people around me, and the world, and how that can impact the world. Mycelium has also taught me to become a young activist and use resources and my voice to help stop climate change. Classes have helped me learn how to use natural resources in case of an emergency. They helped us install a carbon sequestration garden at our school to help fight climate change. Mycelium has taught me many things about the environment and showed my classmates and I things we can do individually to help save the environment. And I wanted to really also start with Lila's a little bit from our young people and what Lila was thinking, so that as we go into this conversation, we're thinking about it both from an ancestral position as well as from the innovation and creativity of young people. So our mission in a nutshell is really to prepare young people for climate change. And we do that using a combination of ancestral traditions and traditional ecological knowledge, as well as just straight ahead science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And we do this in a way that allows young people to both immediately see ways that they can start preparing their homes, their schools, and their communities for climate change, as well as to have them think creatively and innovatively around ways that they can start doing climate change mitigation. And so here's a little bit about our strands of knowledge, the way that we do it. Like I said earlier, we bring in an ancestral tradition and knowledge and wisdom. And the reason we really do that is so that it's from the understanding that communities, for example, here in Oakland, the Ohlone people have existed sustainably in relationship to their land for generations and generations and generations. And that if we are actually going to start making some of the radical shifts that we need to see happen, we have to bring that knowledge to the forefront and understand that these are the knowledge systems that will save us in many ways in the long term. And also recognizing that as we're doing that, we need to bring also the best of scientific thinking to the table in order to support climate and community resilience. And so this is just a few pictures from some of the work that our young people do on a daily basis. On any given day, young people can be learning about the run for salmon. They can be learning about water is life. They can be learning about the Dakota Access Pipeline. They can also be building full-scale water catchment and purification systems that are attached to schools or homes. They can be creating medicinal first aid kits. They can be purifying water. They can be doing a carbon sequestration project. They can be gardening. We really try to think about, as climate change comes, how are we thoughtfully and creatively preparing young people for it? And we recently had a conference, Mycelium had a conference called Apocalyptic Resilience. And we were really blessed to be able to have Isha Clark come as our keynote speaker who's done amazing work with Youth versus Apocalypse. And for her, we had her as like one of the first speakers there because we really wanted to ground her wisdom and knowledge as we started the conference and what that youth voice can look like. And she says, climate justice is about completely reimagining the way that we live on this planet and in this country. It is about collective liberation and dismantling systems of oppression in every single way that they exist. And I want to acknowledge that for young people, as well as for so many communities that are oftentimes called marginalized or disempowered, that this is not, climate change is part of a larger issue that spans across like poverty, that spans across like racism, that spans across like homophobia, heterosexism, that this is not a single issue. This is a comprehensive issue that we need to start thinking about in a larger sense. And the reason that we choose to work with young people at Mycelium is because we're playing the long game. We recognize that climate change is going to have a direct impact on how young people are able to live their lives. A quote that I didn't bring up from Isha Clark, but that she also said at the conference was that she is incredibly concerned that her generation will not be able to fully live out their adult and their elder years. And so if we are going to be making the kind of radical change that we need to start with young people because they will be most impacted, as well as they understand how severe things are. And they are ready to be able to make some of those massive changes, cultural changes that we need to see happen. And we see this also in a way that, like, yes, young people are going to be directly impacted. And at the same time, how do we really think about empowering them to be able to know how they can navigate that system? And part of that for us is how do we avoid adultism? Right? Because a lot of young people often get told that their voices are so inspirational, they're so hopeful, that adults are so excited by the work that, the Sunrise Movement or Youth versus Apocalypse or all of the other youth climate justice movements are doing. But our goal at Mycelium isn't to just say, look how hopeful they are, but to empower them, to educate them whenever necessary, and to lift up their voices so they can bring the kinds of solutions that we want to see happen in the world. And so Mycelium's reach to date, I just put a couple of facts up about like some of the work that we've done. We've currently served over 1,500 young people since our inception. We're gearing up to serve another 500 before the end of this school year. Of those, about 800 young people have taken our virtual classes using interactive kits that we create for them. So there's always an interactive component when they're receiving their learning. We're currently in Oakland Unified School District and San Francisco Unified School District, and we're looking to expand out across the North Bay and South Bay for the 21-22 school year. We're also working directly with organizations because we recognize that some of the places that people still have confidence in are nonprofit organizations that are directly serving their communities. And so we've made an effort to be able to reach out to those communities to say, like, how can we support you regardless of whether you're doing issues around labor, around gender, around like homophobia, like how can we also include that climate justice dynamic? And lastly, we had a conference this year, Apocalyptic Resilience, where we had 150 people, 70 of which were young people, come and start freedom dreaming about not just how do we prepare for climate change, but what is the world and the system that we want to create. in this, we've learned that the best way that we can have, that we can deepen our impact in the work that we do is to actually work across different types of organizations and with different types of partners. And so that looks like us either working directly with an organization doing grassroots work, or it can look like, consulting on issues of equity or empowerment, or how do we go deeper into the STEAM work that we want to do. We've also been blessed to be able to work with the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. So what does this look like at a regional level? What does it look like at a city level to be able to affect the kind of change that we want? And lastly, we've also started exploring non-traditional school or educational organizations like the Exploratorium, so museums and zoos, and how we can support in that process. So I just wanted to leave you with Moya, the voice of another young person at Mycelium Youth Network, who says, adults should listen to kids when it comes to climate change. Adults before my generation didn't do anything about this because they thought, oh, it will be fine. Now we are coming along, so why not try to save the earth for our children and for generations to come? And that's it for me. Feel free to follow us on social media, but I'm really excited for the conversation that we're about to have as a larger group. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Will.
That was amazing.
And I want to insert real quick, invite anybody who has questions or comments for any of our presenters, please put them in the chat. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of this, and we'd love to hear from you. So Traden, would love to hear how you bring this work and change to a community scale, taking a grassroots approach through government collaboration, and what that looks like on the ground and literally in the soil.
And this is building on, hopefully some folks were there this morning, one of the more recent examples from our work. And I just want to say that youth were an important part of the climate emergency work we drove in Petaluma and Sonoma County last year. And to Lil's point, we're super excited to get them at the policy table and creating people and youth-powered policy as well. And, just to really say that Daily Acts is a very collaborative organization, but over the last 15 years of partnering, in particular with local government, we've developed such a deep and strong belief in the power of grassroots and government collaborations. And in addition to our work in Sonoma County, in that time, I've been involved in a lot of coalitions and networks that are purely grassroots at a range of scales, and then been in almost purely government spaces where we're the only grassroots organization, and then also working in blended spaces. So we kind of work with government in a lot of different ways. And, I just want to say 2 nights ago, I was at the Petaluma Climate Commission meeting, and it was the 1-year anniversary of the first meeting. And this was the body that got created out of Climate Action Petaluma's drive to move climate emergency work forward to the city of Petaluma. And, after a really difficult year, it was amazing to see at the end of the night, the city staff, the council commissioners, and the community were just kind of elated at the incredible work that was done in a challenging time. And by the end of the night, the commission passed our climate emergency framework that was powered by the community earlier this year. And this is going to be a guiding document for the development of our next general plan process, which is just starting for the creation of a climate action plan and for near-term actions as well. And so I just want to call out a few of the things in it. And climate justice is one of the 4 core sections, but equity lens was throughout the entire work and document. It has 2030 zero emission and zero waste targets, urban sequestration, addressing consumption-based emissions, which aren't in a lot of climate action plans because of it's out of jurisdictional control for municipalities. So it requires different type of work. And it includes a strong focus on community engagement with the goal of creating a climate action network to build long-term inclusive engagement. And we took a tip off this from the work in Oakland's climate action plan that Lil and the NorCal Resilience Network and others helped get that into the climate plan, the creation of a network. And similar to what you'll hear about some from Brett and Boulder, we recognize in Petaluma that a lot of the stuff that we want to achieve depends on working with others at local, regional, state, and national scale to build a wider movement for these solutions. No community could do it alone, even with bold targets. And so I just want to kind of touch on, being such a collaborative organization, pushing stronger into advocacy really tested us in some ways because we are so collaborative, but we're recognizing there is not an appropriate response anywhere to the climate emergency. And last year in our community, we're looking, there's not a plan on any business, organization, or government tabled as aligned with the science of survival. And ironically, this push into stronger advocacy was encouraged by our government partners a couple of years before. Daily X former Associate Director Gretchen Schubeck became the sustainability coordinator for the city of Novato, and she hosted a climate conference. And at that conference, one of our agency leaders, the head of the agency, and one of our county supervisors said, Trathan, you should come to the Board of Supervisors meeting and let us know what's not in the fire recovery framework from our devastating fires. So it's like, okay, I got a lot on my plate, but all right, I'll read that 90-page document. And I read it, and it looked really amazing and well done and thoughtful and inclusive. I didn't think I had anything to add. And I woke up in the morning and I was astonished at what was missing. It was basically about recovering from the current disaster and preparing for the next disaster. And it didn't include addressing the climate crisis creating these disasters, or the disparity that happens in disaster, or the fact, like in the 2017 fires, there's a massive community response with organizations and coalitions and community members working with government that really led the way. And so the need to build this social infrastructure going forward. And so we spoke with community members and agency staff and agency leaders and a lot of different folks, and came up with these 3 core recommendations I just mentioned to put them as core principles in the framework. And then we mobilized our community to support it, informed by listening to people in all parts of the system. And so then play it forward, 2019, last year, climate emergency is just really clear and heating up. And I talked with dozens and dozens and dozens of agency staff and elected officials and organizational partners. And I'm just kind of amazed in a leadership community like Sonoma County for all the good work that folks are doing. Maybe because the scale was so great, or it didn't seem like people could do anything about it. There was just not any idea of like, yes, we need to address the climate emergency right now. And that was really concerning. And so that led to us saying, all right, we need to start having a lot of conversations, and led to the helping launch Climate Action Petaluma, helping launch an action campaign with our Regional Climate Protection Authority, and just a number of initiatives, because we recognize we still want to work collaboratively, and we need to build the public and political will so whoever can feel safe having this conversation and making bold decisions. So just to touch on, this required our city manager, our council. We're at a very open mindset, and we're very excited to engage and collaborate with the community. And whatever size organization you're in, we can't react from the past and business as usual. We need to lean into the emerging future. So I want to call that out, which can be particularly tough in government organizations, but we have been blessed to have partners who are like, yeah, what does it look like? What do we do? And just to say, briefly.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bioneers community.
Hold on. Just to say briefly, sorry, I got that getting the creation of this new climate commission was amazing. But before that, it was Climate Action Petaluma and the city working every step of the way to pass the resolution to create criteria for the commission that included not just having commissioners with climate expertise, but with cultural expertise from being a frontline community member or bringing a different cultural perspective. And so we wanted to encourage more types of criteria. And even when we, got this body elected and we had a record number of applicants because of community support, we had the first time the city ever did a public process to interview the candidates. But now there's this new complicated player in the ecosystem for us to orient around. And as we build more shared leadership structures, we have to evolve our thinking and our efforts to work in more shared ways, to bring more voices to the table, and just to acknowledge that that's not necessarily super easy. And so again, just playing that forward then into this year, as we know, COVID and more rampant injustice and more record devastation across the West. And I touched on it earlier, but it was so phenomenal to have dozens and dozens of community members and experts come together and create this draft framework. And again, because the city was willing to dance with the community and engage new voices in leadership, you have a half a dozen amazing climate commission members bringing their expertise, and you have dozens of community members that literally created a climate emergency framework for the city that the city had to work with and, massage in that. But as we start to open up in these ways, we could tap the full wisdom and expertise of our youth, of our frontline community members, of our businesses, our organizations. And that's the kind of change in mindset and approach that we need to really rise into this moment. And I think with that, there's other good related pieces about our work on policy, but I'll save that for later. And I'll just close it out there of just huge appreciation and gratitude for the nonprofit, the business, the government partners that are willing to think creatively. And it really brings a lot more resources to the table when you tap and unleash the wisdom of our full communities.
Wow. Thank you so much, Trayton. You covered a lot of ground, 20 years of Daily Acts history in 10 minutes. So we've heard about a youth-centered approach to change, and now Trayton's community-powered approach to change in partnership with cities to create more shared leadership infrastructure and a seat at the table. Now, Brett, would love to hear from you. What are you working on at the government and state scale and beyond?
Yes, and I'm going to share some slides here too. See if I can this pull up relatively seamlessly. Okay. Oops, that's not quite. Let me try that again.
And just for our audience, as Brett gets that set up, Brett is Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and Resilience in Boulder, Colorado. And his organization actually works in collaboration with Lil. So we've got some collaborators right here. So Brett, we'll let you take it away.
Great. And can you see my slides now?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. Yes, thanks. And I do have this kind of unique privilege. Well, first of all, I want to just say it's always an honor to be invited to participate in the Bioneers events. And Bioneers is such an important locus of hope and innovation and really the sort of catalyst of change, I think, in this time. And I think couldn't be more important than now. And to also share this panel with two really, really remarkable organizations. Trayton, I'm so delighted that you were invited to be a part of the keynotes this year, because the work of your organization is truly transformative, and it's a model that many of our communities, I think, could really gain something from. And Lil, your amazing work with youth is just so inspiring, and we're grateful to be able to have the chance to work with you. And so to say, I do work both for the city of Boulder in our climate team and the amazing network of folks both within our city and within our community that are working very actively in that sector. But I also have the distinct privilege to be able to work some outside of the city in this new role of being the director of the Urban Drawdown Initiative. And so a bit of the work I'm going to describe to you today is actually in that context of how we take this work from local to, in this case, national. So I'm hopefully going to get these slides to respond. Here we go. So I do want to start, though, because for you to understand why I'm going to propose the actions, or we're engaging in the actions that we are, I want to be very transparent about what my personal view of theory of change is here. And the first piece, and I think this is something that we went to our city council with last year and said, look, we have one of the most ambitious climate action plans in the world, and it's wholly insufficient to this climate crisis we now face. And that's in part because our plan was really an incrementalist oriented plan, and that we've so little time left now that we have to really get down to the systems level changes that are fundamentally interwoven so that climate change is not a problem, it's a symptom, just like social justice and energy system failures and biodiversity problems are all these interconnected aspects of the systems problems that we face. That those systems are driven by a current economic system that enables a sort of accumulation of economic wealth, which then enables a sort of political power that keeps these kinds of systems in place. That in order to change this, we have to change the rules of how the economy works, basically what it values and what it prioritizes and what it punishes and prohibits. And until we do that, then we will, many of us, continue to live in this kind of perverse incentive worlds where we do a lot of things every day that we know are actually also contributing to the plight that we're in. That, again, to change those economic rules, we have to change the policies. And so I think we have to get much more adept as a community of change practitioners to understand how policy works and how it basically shapes the systems that we're in. And finally, to do that, though, we're going to have to build an understanding and a support across a much broader consortium of views and interests in our society. And I think the last election was a vivid display of that, and that there are places of common ground in this. And so we also need to stop thinking about carbon as a problem and realize that, again, as we all know in Bioneers especially, that carbon is like the basis of life. It's so great always to see Paul's presentations and things, but that carbon is now fundamentally a part of the solution. And so I'll get into how we're actually actualizing that. So I would also sort of emphasize for folks who don't follow the climate science that closely that when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out with their report in 2018, they fundamentally changed the framework of what we have to do to stabilize climate, because they basically said, while for the last 30 plus years we've been telling you that emissions reduction is the primary action and that all the metrics were based on emissions reduction, now we know that in fact you still have to do all of that, in fact even faster than we thought, but we now have to draw a huge amount of carbon back down out of the atmosphere. And then the year later, last year, 2019, they came out with a report that said, in fact, the only way we actually really know how to do that is through natural systems. And that, in fact, that when the analysis was done, and they did this both at a global level, and then there was a subsequent report that came out for the US, that over a third of what we need to do in the next, between now and 2030, can be accomplished through these natural climate solutions. This was the report that came out in 2019. And so where are we going to do that in the natural climate systems? Well, we think often about forests, and of course, there's a lot of potential there. And then there's been a lot of discussion about soils and agriculture, and that's a huge opportunity. But there's an often overlooked opportunity in the urban context of both soils, which we can get to later, but also especially in the urban forests, and that there's actually a very significant amount of carbon that's currently sequestered in those forests and that could be sequestered. This is just a snapshot from Boulder's urban forest strategic plan, which shows that, in fact, we have something like almost $1 million in annual benefits that are coming from the carbon that's sequestered, the air quality, the stormwater avoided, et cetera. And so what we're really trying to do now is to figure out how we give communities, cities, and stakeholders in those communities the tools with which we can now start managing carbon. And so rather than just thinking about carbon as a problem that we're going to take out of the atmosphere and put somewhere and hopefully it goes away, instead, no, we actually want to capture that carbon and manage it into living systems in ways that then accentuate the kinds of critical ecosystem services we need. We need more shade to manage urban heat. We need more stormwater retention to manage these storm events. We need more detoxified soils and more nutrient-dense food. Those are all values that we can create if we manage carbon into these systems. So we've been working on tools with Trust for Public Land and others. This is a snapshot of a tool that we were about to release, in which cities will be able to actually spatially see where their challenges are, heat islands and things, and where we would want to direct carbon into those places through trees and other sources. But that has to be a part of a sort of larger intersectional strategy. So we're doing a lot of work with Cleveland, which is an amazing community, by the way, doing an amazing amount of things. So with Red All Green Partnership there, that's this amazing urban ag effort, with the Western Reserve Land Conservancy that's launching a Million Trees initiative, with this amazing biochar, bioenergy effort, with this amazing compost piece, which are all parts of a new economy around carbon management. And this is a part of a larger network of cities, both the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and now the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, who are all starting to launch these initiatives. And in USDN, we have over 60 cities and counties that are meeting monthly to start building these carbon management plans. And CNCA, we're starting to build a whole new focus area around bioenergy and biochar and helping to build those models for other cities. So I wanted to touch briefly on a campaign that we're also launching now, which is about how we actually position this work as an economic recovery opportunity. In this case, specifically urban forests. So Urban Drawdown Initiative, USDN, Trust for Public Land, American Forest, Davey Tree are now launching an initiative that plan to have a set of policy agenda proposals in front of the next Congress and administration within the first 100 days to place billions of dollars back out into communities around significantly expanding urban forests to achieve not only climate benefits, but especially equity-driven community development and other ecosystem service benefits like stormwater and heat and so on. Why would we do this? Well, it's actually quite interesting. I don't want you to try to read that report, but here's the sort of summary. Natural resource jobs generate 2 to 7 times more jobs than other related infrastructure investments. And then in the case, now this is saying that forestry and green infrastructure are the highest, and that's true. Even urban forestry is at about 25 jobs per $1 million investment. That's much higher than most of these other infrastructure areas. The point is we can make an analytic argument for why these natural system investments are the best place to put money if we want to put people back to work. And there's good analysis of this. World Resources Institute did a great report earlier this year on this. This is some of the great work that Green of Detroit's doing that's showing how that is done in urban settings. There's a whole raft of legislation that was introduced last session. We don't know exactly what the next sessions will look like, but we're working on that, so stay tuned. We would love all of you to be a part of helping to advocate for this, I think, fairly groundbreaking move. And then the campaign itself is going to have really two really fundamental aspects. One is get the money and how we bring the sort of policy agenda and all the stakeholders to make that happen. But the other is getting cities and community-based organizations shovel ready for equity-based community development around this urban forest expansion. But I want to really emphasize this, and I'm going to end on this point. Unless we figure out how we're going to create a sustained economy around the development and ongoing care of this urban ecosystem, in this case forest, but more broadly, it will not be sustained. We might get a lot of money in a short period of time to plant a lot of trees, and then maybe most of those trees will not even survive. So we have to be thinking about this from a much more systemic and broader scope way of how are we going to build a new sector that refocuses the economy and makes it emphasize paying people to do this work. And so we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like in this context. But I would just say that this is only one context. There's many others: building electrification, water systems, wildfire mitigation. I would argue that we could be thinking through strategies to employ literally millions of people for decades if we start to think about this as an economic restructuring and refocusing effort. So with that, I'll close, and very much looking forward to the conversations that follow. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. I can hear an auditorium full round of applause for each of you with the depth and information and knowledge that you've offered. And I love the reframe, Brett, of the problem is the solution, and the impact on the ground of investing in natural systems and the sustainability of creating jobs. And that sounds a little bit like Green New Deal framing. So we're going to move into a conversation now. And I want to remind our beautiful audience, if you have questions, we're getting great questions in the chat. Please throw it out, offer ideas, insights, reflections too. We just really are excited to engage with you. So we'd love to hear from you, and please add that to the chat. So we're going to have a little conversation now about strategies for leveraging collaboration across multiple sectors. And we're going to start with you, Brett. What are the strategies that you're employing or seeing employed to bridge grassroots and government efforts?
Yeah,
what's working and what's not?
There's just so much fun that's about to happen because we were preparing for some of these topics, and I think we have some very fun things to talk about. But I think I want to make sure that people who are not in government just realize the degree to which if you are trying to relate to some aspect of government now, especially local government, you're dealing with a very traumatized entity who is trying to figure out how to manage multiple crises simultaneously. And very often the thing that you may want to talk about is not going to be the first and highest priority on those lists. So just like in any good community organizing, the first thing you need to do when you start to engage this party is to figure out what are your priorities, what are your needs, what are you struggling with? And then how do I help you with that so that we can start working with the things that we want to work on too? And I think there's lots of intersects between the kinds of economic and social and public health crises that the public sector is facing and the kinds of changes that we need to be making. Like, this is why we've launched this urban forest as economic recovery effort, because we know the first and highest priority of the government right now is putting people back to work. So we start there, but it happens to actually be also directly related to how we're trying to achieve our climate goals. So.
Awesome. And would love to hear from you, Trayton, too. What are your thoughts on this? You are muted still.
Sorry, I was moving around on my screens. Can you restate that question for me?
We've got you. What are the strategies you're employing or seeing employed to bridge grassroots and government efforts? What's working and what's not? And if you have comments on some of the Green New Deal-like framing that Brett's put out there.
I'll just, on that note, I'm a huge fan of the work of Sunrise and the Climate Youth, and seeing this narrative. The Green New Deal is the only major frame that I see out there. It builds on historical wins, and that it's creating a polarization politically. So I just want to reference how excited I am to watch Chloe Maxman's keynote from Bioneers last weekend, who won in a red state that she's from progressive framing and orientation. So I'll seed that for people if they didn't watch it. Relative to our lessons, a key thing is having champions in government, from staff to elected officials. It's finding a person who's open to being a champion, and sometimes educating them or getting educated. It's building relations. Sometimes it's electing them, but having champions like Brett, people like Brett, it amazes me this guy works for government. I'm so thankful. And I love all the people like you, Brett. And then so implementation and advocacy, doing those together. A lot of times a nonprofit will do education or implementation work, or they do advocacy work. And it's tough for small nonprofits, but doing these things together, doing the boots on the ground, installing gardens, meeting the needs of existing government for the water conservation or whatever, and then encouraging them on how they could innovate or evolve more quickly, and bringing expertise to the table, not telling them to do stuff, say, hey, here's some ideas, here's the experts. So that's 2, champions, implementation, advocacy. And then working towards this seat at the table of structural change. Again, whether it's informal relationships or creating a commission that is populated by community expertise versus speaking at the commission for 3 minutes. Great to speak at the commission, but let's get people on the commission, or even like what Oakland's doing and we propose in our framework, starting to create these structural shifts, I think is really important.
Fantastic. And Lil, would you like to talk about your strategies you're employing?
Yeah, I think that for us, it comes in 2 different ways. Like, one is, how are we thinking, again, about the long game? And by that, I don't just mean how do we get a particular bill passed, or how do we make sure there's enough energy to make sure that X policy, gets through the door. I really believe that if we are going to have the radical change that we need to start shifting our very culture, so that it is something that is demanded from the grassroots on up, and that that grassroots feels educated and empowered enough to be able to feel comfortable having that voice at the table. And I often hear in a lot of environmental justice circles, it's how do we get more people to the table? We've already have this policy that's in place or that we're thinking about, how do we make sure that we have the right people at the table to get it passed? And I personally believe that if that's the framework, and if that's the question at that moment, then we've already lost that long game campaign. And that what we need to start doing is really looking at what are the issues that communities deeply care about. And I've been in fantastic conversations and really bad conversations with both government officials or regional players that are trying to figure out how do we bring the local in, and what works best. And what I hear from community is sometimes not that immediate, either Green New Deal language, or not that immediate, how do we push environmental, policies forward? It is here's an issue that I care about in my neighborhood. There's trash on the street, or there's a lot of crime, or there's not any good transit. And I think that oftentimes city people or policy people can be really discouraged by that. And at the same time, what was beautiful about the Oakland's Equitable Climate Action Plan is that we took the issues that communities deeply care about. Because you cannot ask communities to have a voice in larger issues that feel maybe outside of their realm of understanding if we are not helping them, if we're not resourcing them with the things that they need to provide and live. And so there's a fantastic Audre Lorde quote that says, we don't live single issue. There's no such thing as single issue struggles, because we do not live single issue lives. And so thinking about what does it mean to resource communities? What does it mean to resource people, to provide them education and empowerment, so that when they are at the table, they feel incredibly confident in being able to speak about both their immediate environment that they want to see shifted and changed. And then how do we think about a larger policy? And from a youth perspective, I'll say oftentimes we get asked to have young people come and speak about a particular issue. Again, I feel there's a little bit of always adultism to that. We just want them to have that hopeful message. And young people see right through that. They're fantastic at always seeing through us when we are patronizing them in many ways. And so for us, it's about, again, like, how do we provide resources, empowerment? How do we center what they care about? Not so that we can get to what we care about, but recognizing that what they care about, when they start giving, similar to when we work in communities, when they start giving the solutions they want to see, they will generally be more radical, more in-depth, more comprehensive than anything that like I or like a policymaker or a planner can like even think about, because they're seeing their lives within a larger context. And so it's about addressing it at multiple steps so that we can be able to have that cultural push that feels so natural.
Well, I've never heard the term adultism, so that's new for me, and I'm really appreciating it and resonating with it, and really learning a lot from all three of you. And culture change does feel like such a deeply pivotal point to start, and the ripple effect of that is huge. And so we've got another question for you, and then we're going to be opening it up to the audience for your question. Thank you to everybody who has asked so far. So the next question is, how do we improve involving the community in community development? And Lil, we're going to start with you.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what I had covered before. It's like I think one of the primary things that, you learn in organizing, or that I learned as an organizer, is that if you want people to care about the issues that you care about, then you need to care about the issues that they care about, which means you go to events that they're doing, which means you live within the community, which means like you are consistently having conversations with people. You're willing to be humbled, and you're bringing in a diverse group of voices when you do that. And one of the things that we think about a lot at Mycelium is growing that change, growing that vision from within the structure of the organization. And by that, I mean, for example, like on our staff, we're a predominantly staff of color. We have people that are gender non-binaries, that have access issues. And these are all things that we're consistently grappling with as a staff. So that when we come to community, when we bring in community, when we're in that conversation, it is not something that we are learning about for the very first time. It's something that we are challenging ourselves individually and organizationally to be able to figure out and to be able to deal with. And so that when we go to events, and we always make sure that like we are in partnership with other communities, with other organizations, with issues that people care about. I live within, I would say, like a 3-block radius to at least half a dozen of the students I serve. When I think about what it means to be in community, I'm like, I live in my community. I make sure that like salaries that are similar to what people are making within my community. So there is not this place of disassociation, or I'm not coming to a community to be able to save it, but I've lived and I've worked alongside them. We're at the same events. We're caring about the same things, so that when I make an ask, whether that is an organizational ask or whether that's something like we're trying to, we're part of a larger coalition to be able to push public policy, that people know like we're in it together. They know that I'm not just here for that single issue, that I'm here for like a larger conversation and a larger movement for liberation.
That really gets at what you started with at the beginning of being root, right, relationship, and starting at the root of relationships, and really struggling with the difficult decisions and choices and navigation of a path forward together. That sounds really powerful. Thank you. Trathan, same question. How do we improve involving the community in community development?
Yeah, I was going to go a whole route on the people-powered policy thing, and it kind of ties that, but I saw Susan Silber's one of our great partners at NorCal Resilience Network of mentioning that we need to pay organizers. And so just to call out, like in our comments that I mentioned about the Office of Recovery, of investing in social infrastructure, of getting organizations, getting government contracts, getting this stuff written into city climate plans and frameworks, we need a different approach to thinking about collaboration. We can't just have underfunded grassroots groups starting dozens and dozens of coalitions and doing all the bridge connecting in all the parts of government. We do the best we can with it, and all the money won't solve it. But a thing we've tried to work on is creating a fundamental shift of not just tapping a community expert to serve on a volunteer committee or something. We have to start to direct resources to invest in building these coalitions and organizations that can think and act systemically and be better partners for our government agencies to help create the change that's necessary. So I want to say a big part is getting more people paid to do this important grassroots nonprofit and coalition work is really key. Donating to those organizations, volunteering, but like that's the bigger picture, part of the social infrastructure piece to me. Like Brett said, like we got to do a lot of building on the ground in our communities to even be ready when resources do come. And so starting to invest in those ways feels really important.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. I think as we move from planning to action, it's going to be impossible for any single entity, especially government, to design and implement the solutions that are necessary. These are so broad-based that they're going to have to be solutions that are developed and managed through a whole network of different actors. So to be very specific, in the context of urban forestry, we will have to create not just a local initiative in Boulder. I saw a question about what about Boulder and Denver working together. We're actually working on a regional initiative to prepare our entire network of cities across that area to be gearing up to launch this scale up of urban ecosystems management with a whole network of community-based organizations, largely being the implementing bodies. And that's where I think we need to start figuring out how we're going to resource all that implementation as a way that we build and maintain that community-based organization capacity. So I agree that yes, we need to fund community-based organizations to be a part of the planning effort, but where I think the rubber really hits the road is when we start to actually do things out there and figure out the implementation mechanisms that coordinate and mobilize all those resources together. I do want to throw this out because I want to provoke this conversation. I appreciate the reference to Chloe's presentation. I think it was fantastic, and I think everybody should see it. But one of the things that she said in there, and this relates back to what Lil was saying, is that she was running her campaign, and then suddenly COVID hit, and she did a brilliant thing. Because she's a community organizer, because she cares about her community, she stopped her campaign. And she went out and did direct community service to the elders in her community that were actually suffering. And every major revolutionary movement that I know of that was successful had this very significant social service element. If the Democratic Party wants to be relevant in the future, it needs to move beyond being a sort of positions organization to being a true community service organization and being out there on the ground delivering to the needs of all parts of the community, not just Democrats. Because right now there's a whole bunch of our society that feels completely abandoned by all political parties. But I think quite rightly, they've been abandoned by the Democratic Party too. So Green New Deal, lovely idea. Completely dead in the water, if you ask me, in terms of a way we're going to move policy. I think it's a great way to sort of set a conversation. But in terms of how we're going to move it forward, that's what we're going to move specific elements of this forward. Urban forestry over here, wildfire mitigation over there, green infrastructure over there, building electrification over here. I don't think we should bundle them together into single. And I think we need to do those in ways that show that we care about the people that we want to be able to have gainful, meaningful employment in this new world that we're talking about.
Thank you. That is a lot to discuss and chew on in there, and appreciate the banter and riffing off that as well. Are there any other comments on this before we open up to questions from the audience?
I'd love to talk with more Brett about that, but I think there's a bunch of good questions in the audience we should lean into. We could easily,
That sounds good. I saw you leaning in, Trey, and I was like, okay, so first question is, with so many environmental organizations that exist, why do we remain in such dire straits? What if we came up with a plan to act collectively on big projects? For example, turning Richmond's Chevron into a solar farm that hires locally. And we'll just open it up to whoever wants to answer the question.
I mean, I can start us off in relationship to this question. I really like this question, and I like it because I believe that the way that we have done organizing, and I've been an organizer for about 20 years now, the way that we have traditionally understood to do organizing is not going to help us to make the kind of change that we need to have happen to be able to save ourselves and to save the planet in many ways. And I say that because I think that oftentimes both environmental justice organizations as well as other nonprofits, and I've worked across a plethora of them, we're so used to being siloed. So it is this understanding of like, here's my issue and how do I just hone in on this issue? And I do not think about necessarily the larger impact or like having a more comprehensive understanding. And I think that that's definitely part of the nonprofit industrial complex, which has also been covered really well by a few different organizations and books. But it's thinking about like how, as we go into this next phase, like these next 10 years or 9 years that we have, right? 2030 is the defining moment of like our deadline to really make radical change. I like fundamentally believe that like government will not save us. The nonprofit industrial complex will not save us. Community will not save us. We need to collectively come together and to figure out a solution that is leveraging points at each of these levels in order to make the kind of radical change that we need to have happen. And so something like, and what I appreciate about like the Urban Drawdown initiative is it's pulling resources and it's pulling thinking from a plethora of different organizations to be able to come together to craft a solution that feels holistic and comprehensive. And that's the kind of thinking that we need to start doing. We need to start breaking out of like the silos of whether it's government or nonprofits or business and start thinking about how do we innovate the field, right? And I think that when I talk to young people, this is like their question, like why these silos make no sense to them. They're not as bought into the system. They're like, why wouldn't we all just be working together to craft solutions to be able to move something forward? And I think that the Richmond solution is a great idea of something that can happen. I am completely in favor of the Equitable Climate Action Plan from Oakland, even though so many of community members were like, it doesn't go far enough, but that's the kind of big level thinking that we need to think about. And I feel like environmental justice organizations like other nonprofits are in the dire straits because we're so siloed, because we're assuming that people live single issue lives and we're crafting solutions that are based on that. And that doesn't create buy-in or ownership or a sense of like larger self, I guess.
I think you've hit on so much there. And I think it also goes back, it seems like that to what Brett said around economic overhaul. Our philanthropy models are very siloed as well. You know, they usually fund single solutions. So how do we also fund in an integrated level? I think you really hit so much on the head there. We're going to move to another question. So we're able to get through as many as we can. The focus at local government seems to be on education and mental health. So focusing on those may be the most potential to gain momentum. I see all three of your initiatives potentially being integrated on the theme of integration. Do you agree, or do you have other thoughts?
I'm not sure I experience local government having a significant focus on mental health. In fact, part of what we've been trying to stimulate by organizing in constituencies outside the city to try to come back and tell us this is that we need to do more sort of preparation for the kinds of disruptive traumatic experience that we're going to be going through as a society, because this isn't a short-term thing and it's not in a one sector aspect. We're going to be going through multiple disruptive traumas for a long time. And unless we think through a whole new framework for mobilizing our public health resources and our private health resources to address that in a new way, we're just going to be a mess. And that's not something I see the public sector actually focusing on. So I think that we do need to be doing that, but that's not what I see happening inside. I mean, right now inside the public sector, they're trying to manage downsizing of their own organizations and economic recovery in this most simplistic, frankly, way that you could imagine. Like, how do we just get this thing started back up again like we did in 2008? And part of what I would argue is in 2008, we almost had a chance to do systems change, but the same folks that ran the sort of structure of the economy basically got a hold of it again and stood it back up in the way that they had structured it before. This is the moment, as hard and difficult and full of suffering as it's going to be, for us to maybe get a chance to restructure the system. And if you were to ask me why, with all these many years of organizations, we haven't seen any change, it's because we've all been participating in the same materialist society that has to change. And that's hard. And we don't really ultimately want it to change because we've kind of enjoyed it, especially those of us who've been privileged enough to live in that sort of middle class way. But a whole bunch more of us aren't living that way now. So I think there's the constituency that's building to think of a new way.
Yeah, and I think that is such a huge topic. And I'm going to offer another question too. If you want to go back to the topic of education and mental health, feel free to riff. And it's a huge topic, and everything starts with a conversation, right? And a daily act. So how do we get a conversation started with local officials who come from very different perspectives? For example, a small Texas town rooted in historical ways of living, rooted in racism and conventional agriculture, led entirely by older white males in leadership levels of city government, for example.
That's a big example that requires a longer conversation than we have time for, I would say. I do want to briefly touch on the mental health one. And I agree, I don't see a huge focus. Health and Human Services is the second largest department in Sonoma County, so there's a lot of resources overall. But I actually made a specific point on Thursday night to our climate commission that then the commissioners integrated in the framework. There was completely missing, for all the bold stuff we got in that framework, we had no goal or principle around addressing the mental and emotional health crisis of dealing with unending crisis and dealing with an existential crisis. And so we did get it inserted in the plan, but it's largely missing from the conversation. Or integrating things like sequestration and increasingly centering more on equity, but the mental emotional health piece is missing from pretty much all the conversations I see about climate. There is a great resource that we helped, one of the coalitions we helped launch in the fire in Sonoma County is the Community Resilience Collaborative, which partnered with the Center for Mind Body Medicine to scale up these practices in a trauma-informed way in communities. And so that could be a resource to bring the important mental health angle in. And I will say, I can't answer all the specifics on the Texas conversation, but there was another comment in the chat that I saw that was kind of similar territory of, if government isn't getting the level of urgency, how can we help them get it? And that, it went through really quick, but that was a lot of the point that I made in my talk earlier. You know, it was a group of about 5 of us that rallied 400 people to sign a petition. We got 100 people outside of our city's planning session. We worked in advance with the staff and the council, and we built the public and political will. Not a lot of people really. You don't need a lot to show up to change the conversation. I've been surprised at how few for us are seeing sunrisers. You change the conversation if you organize, and in doing it in a proactive way. And we've changed the conversation in our community about climate. There's plenty more work to do, but looking at the tactics the youth are using is a great way. And there's this global climate emergency movement. 1,700 municipalities across the planet have declared a climate emergency. So get them to declare climate emergency as a step in the awareness raising.
I just have to weigh in. I don't agree with that. I don't think the first step in a small Texas town is to go in and try to.
No, I wasn't saying a small Texas town. Absolutely, at all. There was another comment in the thread in the chat that said, our local government doesn't get the urgency. How can we help educate them? So I was tying that together. Given what that person wrote about, no, I would not start that way there.
And I don't want to punt that question. And I want Lil to maybe weigh in on this, but I think from a community organizer standpoint, for one thing, yeah, the systems have not been susceptible to change for decades. For the whole time that I've been a community organizer like Lil, we've been pushing in a completely impossible way, but they are becoming susceptible now. But it's not going to be because we walk in the midst of people suffering and say, oh, now you should be really paying attention to climate. It's like, oh, you're not able to meet your equipment payments, or you're really struggling. Like, how do we genuinely work, as you said, Lil, like with the issues that I care about, your issues too. And we all want to survive. So there's these other things that we might want to be thinking about working on too. I think that there are doorways in all these communities as this starts to unravel.
Yeah, and I would just add, especially going back a little bit to the education and mental health question, is really working in education right now. Mycelium does, and that I don't see any urgency around education. I think our teachers are under a ridiculous amount of strain. I think that COVID obviously is hitting people extremely hard, and COVID also opened up the reality that our educational system wasn't working for a lot of students, that it was actually failing them every single day. And that right now, what I'm seeing as our response has been how do we then get back to the system that wasn't working for students, rather than how do we think into young people? How do we care about the issues that they care about? Provide that social and emotional support. Provide that mental health. I think the International Transformational Resilience Coalition has fantastic resources about mental health and how we need to start prioritizing that, especially as we see higher levels of climate change, emergencies hitting different communities. But I think that if COVID has revealed anything, is that the system doesn't work. And so what do we want to be able to put in its place? How do we both support educators, and I mean like at a labor perspective, like as workers that can feel empowered to be able to have a good job that's not so stressful, and that's not literally killing them. I've seen too many of that too, of like teachers who have COVID that are teaching through COVID, which is ridiculous. But like, what does it mean now for us to be able to prioritize the social and emotional health of young people, and both in relationship to COVID, in relationship to the climate crisis as well, and to create that sense of urgency, because they do feel that sense of urgency. They are terrified about what is coming, and nobody is talking to them about it. Like, educational system not talking to them about it, teachers generally not talking to them about it, and what I have appreciated about young people and the way that they're organizing is they're taking the structures that as organizers, at least as I was taught, and kind of turning that on its head and saying, we will make this a source of urgency for us. For you, so that you understand how serious this is. And so then it's my job now as an adult to be like, what can I do to support you, to empower you, to be able to speak that message as loudly as possible.
Thank you very much, Lil. And that is a strong finish, just on time. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. I encourage you to check out Mycelium Youth Network's website, Urban Drawdown Initiative, and dailyacts.org to learn more and plug in. Together, we can really do this. Thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful weekend, Bioneers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.